On a morning in 1968, in a tree line above a valley in the Central Highlands, a North Vietnamese anti-aircraft gunner named Tuan had a perfect shot at an American helicopter, and he did not take it. It was right there. A Huey, low and slow, crossing the valley a few hundred meters away, fat and loud, and close enough that Tuan could see the door gunner in the opening. Every instinct he had screamed at him to fire. He had a heavy machine gun, dug in, well-sighted, loaded. He could not have asked for a better target. In almost any other circumstance in the history of war, a soldier with a gun and an enemy in his sights simply shoots. That is the whole idea. Tuan held his fire. He watched the helicopter cross the valley and fly away untouched. And it was not because he was afraid to die. He had proven 100 times that he was not. It was because he had learned something about that war that had turned his own weapon into the most dangerous thing he owned. He had learned that the moment he fired, he would be seen. Not by the helicopter necessarily, by everything else. The instant his gun opened up, it would announce itself. A stab, a muzzle flash. A stream of tracer reaching into the sky, a signature visible for miles to every American aircraft in the air. And the Americans had built a war around punishing exactly that. Fire at one of their aircraft, and you did not just risk that aircraft shooting back. You told the gunships where you were. You told the jets. You told the artillery. You lit a signal flare over your own position. And in that war, being found was a sentence carried out very quickly. Tuan could not know that the men in that helicopter would never learn how close they had come, or that a gunner had held them in his sights and let them go. They flew on, oblivious, alive, and Tuan lay in the tree line with his perfect shot untaken, having made the calculation that every NVA gunner in that war learned to make. His gun could kill the aircraft in front of him, but firing it might kill him. And most targets were simply not worth dying for. That is what made a brave man with a loaded gun and a perfect shot lie still and let the enemy fly away. Now let me show you how the Americans did that to him. If a story like this matters to you, if the men who lived it on both sides deserve to be remembered, a like and a subscribe help it reach the people who care. It takes 1 second. These are the stories the history books leave out. Now, to understand why a brave man would let a perfect target fly away, you have to understand what happened to gunners who fired. And you have to understand the trap the Americans built into the sky itself. To understand Tuan's held breath in that tree line, you first have to understand a strange and fundamental truth about anti-aircraft fire, one that shaped the entire air war over Vietnam. A weapon that shoots at aircraft is also a weapon that announces itself to aircraft. It points, in a sense, both ways. Think about what firing a heavy machine gun or an anti-aircraft cannon actually involves. It is one of the least subtle things a human being can do. There is a muzzle flash. It's a bright, stabbing burst of light at the end of the barrel, repeated many times a second. There is the tracer. The glowing rounds mixed into the belt so the gunner can see where his fire is going, which means a visible rope of light reaching up from the ground into the sky. There is smoke and dust kicked up by the muzzle blast and noise. An anti-aircraft gun firing is, quite literally, one of the most visible things on a battlefield. It is a machine for drawing attention to itself. Picture it from the air at night, and you understand the problem instantly. The whole world below is black. Jungle, mountains, nothing. And then, somewhere down there, a gun opens up. Suddenly there is a stammering point of light in the dark, a bright flicker, and above it a line of glowing tracer climbing into the sky like a finger pointing straight down at the man who fired. You cannot miss it. From a mile away, from several miles away, every pilot in the sky turns his head and thinks the same thing. There, that is where he is. In daylight, it is only a little less obvious. The flash is harder to see, but the tracer still reaches up, and the smoke and dust of a firing position hang in the still jungle air, and a trained eye circling above knows exactly what he is looking at. The gun cannot whisper. It can only shout, and every time it shouts, it gives away the one thing its crew needs most, which is for the enemy not to know they are there. In most wars, this did not matter so much because everyone could see roughly where everyone else was anyway. But Vietnam was different, and the difference is the whole story. In the jungle, the North Vietnamese lived and moved by being invisible. Their entire survival depended on the Americans not being able to see them, on staying hidden under the canopy, in the tree lines, in positions the Americans could not find. Invisibility was not a tactic for them. It was the foundation of their existence in a war against an enemy who could destroy anything he could locate. And an anti-aircraft gun is the enemy of invisibility. The moment it fires, it throws away the one thing keeping its crew alive. It converts a hidden position into a lit-up, smoking, tracer-spewing beacon that can be seen from the air for a great distance. A gunner opening fire on an American aircraft was, in the same instant, revealing his exact location to every other American aircraft in the sky and to the forward air controllers whose entire job was to find hidden positions, and to the artillery observers who could bring down shell fire on a set of coordinates in under a minute. So the gun that could kill an aircraft was also the thing most likely to get its crew killed. Every time a gunner reached for the trigger, he was making a bet. He was betting that whatever he could destroy in the next few seconds was worth more than the position he was about to reveal, and worth more than the retaliation that revelation would bring. And the Americans who understood this perfectly spent the entire war making sure that bet was a bad one. They built a machine of retaliation so fast, so heavy, and so certain that the simple act of firing at an American aircraft became, for the man on the ground, one of the most dangerous decisions he could make. That is the trap at the center of the story. Not a weapon. A choice forced on the enemy gunner every time a tempting target crossed his sights, and rigged by American design so that the safe answer was almost always to do nothing at all. And it was a choice he had to make in seconds, over and over, with his life on the table each time. A target appears, the clock starts. Is it worth it? How high is it? How fast? How likely am I to hit it? Is it alone? Or is something waiting above it? Is anyone else already firing so my flash will be lost in theirs? Or am I the only gun in the valley, which means every eye in the sky will find me the instant I open up? How good is my escape route? Can I fire and move before the answer comes? All of that, weighed in the time it takes the aircraft to cross a gap in the trees, and then the target is gone, and he has either taken the shot and started the clock on his own destruction, or held it and swallowed the frustration and lived. Most experienced gunners, most of the time, chose to live. That is the quiet fact this whole story turns on. Not because they were afraid of the fight, but because they had done the arithmetic so many times that it had become instinct, and the instinct said, not this one. Let it go. Wait for the target that is worth dying for. To understand why Tuan held his fire, you have to see what happened to the men who did not. Because the Americans had built an answer to ground fire that was fast, overwhelming, and, above all, certain. And every experienced NVA gunner had either seen it happen or heard about it from the men who survived it. Here is what firing on an American aircraft could set in motion. The first thing was that the aircraft itself often shot back, and shot back hard. many American aircraft that flew low were not helpless. Helicopter gunships bristled with machine guns and rockets, and a gunship that took fire from a tree line could turn and pour an appalling volume of fire back onto that exact spot within seconds. Even the troop-carrying Hueys had door gunners whose job was to suppress ground fire. So the first cost of firing was immediate. You might have just started a duel with an aircraft far better armed than you were, and you had helpfully shown it precisely where to aim. But the aircraft you fired at was rarely the real danger. The real danger was everything it called. Because the moment an American aircraft took ground fire, its crew got on the radio. And the American sky was a connected thing, a web of aircraft and observers all talking to each other, all able to bring in more. A single burst of tracer from a tree line could summon a response out of all proportion to the thing that triggered it. There were forward air controllers orbiting whose entire purpose was to find exactly this kind of hidden position and mark it. There were fighter bombers on call or already in the air. There was artillery, ranged and waiting. There were more gunships. The aircraft you fired at was not one enemy. It was the near end of a chain that stretched back to an airbase full of ordnance, and firing on it yanked that whole chain. So the sequence that a gunner risked every time he fired went something like this. He fires. He reveals his position. The aircraft radios his location. A forward air controller comes to that spot and puts a smoke rocket on it. Fighter bombers arrive and work the position over, or artillery called to the coordinates saturates it, or gunships roll in and rake the tree line. And all of this could unfold in minutes, sometimes in less time than it took the gunner's crew to displace to a new position. The Americans had built a system whose entire purpose was to make the ground pay immediately and heavily for revealing itself. Watch it happen once, and you never forget it. A gun opens up on a passing aircraft. Tracer climbs. Maybe the aircraft is hit, maybe not. And then the sky answers. The aircraft banks hard and radios. Within a minute or two, a small spotter plane is overhead, circling the tree line, and a smoke rocket streaks down and marks the spot in brilliant white. The gunners know exactly what that smoke means. They are already trying to move, dragging the gun, running. And it is already too late. The jets are inbound. The first bomb walks across the tree line. Then the second. The position that fired 30 seconds ago no longer exists. The men who survived that, and displaced in time, carried the lesson in their bones. The men who did not survive it taught the lesson to everyone who dug them out. Firing was not a tactic. Firing was a gamble with your own life as the stake, and the house nearly always won. The North Vietnamese had a grimly accurate understanding of this, and it shaped everything. They knew that firing on aircraft was, much of the time, a way of committing suicide with extra steps. They knew that the muzzle flash and the tracer were, in effect, a request for an airstrike on their own position, and so the decision to fire became a genuine agony, weighed every single time, because the man making it understood that he might be trading his life and the lives of his whole crew for the small chance of damaging one aircraft that the Americans could easily replace. That is what stayed Tuan's hand in the tree line. Not fear of the helicopter. Fear of the answer the helicopter could call down. He had seen what happened to positions that fired. He had, perhaps, helped dig the men out afterward. And he had learned the lesson the Americans were teaching, the one that turned every tempting target into a test of nerve and judgment. The question was never, can I hit it? The question was always, is it worth what firing will cost me? Out of that terrible arithmetic, the North Vietnamese built something remarkable, and it is the part of this story that deserves real respect. They built a discipline. They learned, as an army, to master one of the hardest things a soldier can be asked to do, to hold fire on a target he can hit again and again, and wait. Think about how hard that actually is. Every instinct in a soldier, especially one being hunted from the air, screams at him to shoot at the thing threatening him. The aircraft overhead are killing his friends. They are the enemy's great advantage, the thing he hates and fears most. And here is one of them, low and slow and in range, a perfect target. To lie still and let it pass, to master that instinct not once but every day for years, takes a discipline that is genuinely extraordinary. The North Vietnamese soldier became, out of necessity, one of the most fire-disciplined fighters of the 20th century. Do not underrate how hard that is. Discipline under fire is one thing. Every good army has it. This was discipline under temptation, which is rarer and harder. It is one thing to hold your position when you are being attacked. It is another thing entirely to lie still, safe and unseen, with the enemy you hate most drifting past in easy range, and to choose deliberately to do nothing, to let him go, to watch the thing that has been killing your friends fly away unharmed, because shooting it is not worth the cost. A man has to master not just his fear, but his anger and his pride and the simple animal urge to strike at what threatens him. He has to do it silently, alone in the dark, with no one to praise him for the shot he did not take. And he has to do it again tomorrow, and the day after, for years. They developed elaborate rules about when to shoot and when to stay hidden, and the rules all flowed from the same cold logic. Do not fire at a target that is not worth your position. A single helicopter passing by, not even aware of you, on its way somewhere else? Let it go. It is not worth revealing a gun position you have spent weeks preparing. A lone observation plane, droning along? Usually, let it go, because firing at it does nothing but summon the strike it will call. The rule was patience. The rule was to disappear and stay disappeared and give the Americans nothing to find. But, and this is the other half of the discipline, they also learned exactly when it was worth it. Because sometimes it was. The whole point of holding fire most of the time was to be able to deliver a devastating blow at the moment it mattered most. And so they saved their guns for the targets that justified the cost. The great example was the helicopter assault. When the Americans came into a landing zone in force, waves of troop-carrying helicopters bringing an entire infantry unit into a clearing, that was worth firing for. That was a target that justified revealing everything because the prize was so large. Not one aircraft, but many, packed with men at their most vulnerable moment, hovering to unload. For a target like that, the NVA would prepare in advance, sighting their guns around the likely landing zones, holding their fire through everything else, and waiting, sometimes for days, for the assault to come. And when it did, they would open up with everything at once, accepting that they had revealed themselves because the payoff was worth the price. So the discipline had two faces, and both of them were about the same calculation. Most of the time, it meant the agonizing restraint of letting good targets fly away untouched to preserve the position and avoid the retaliation. And occasionally, it meant the opposite. A sudden, total, prepared violence, unleashed at the one moment when the target was finally worth what firing would cost. The gunner's whole art was knowing which moment was which, and the Americans, without ever fully intending to, had made that judgment the defining skill of the enemy who fought their aircraft. Picture the payoff side of it, because it is the other half of the discipline, and it was terrible. A valley the Americans want, a clearing in it, the obvious place to land troops, and for days beforehand, unseen, the NVA prepare it. They sight heavy machine guns in the tree lines, angle to cover the open air over the grass. They range their mortars on the clearing. They camouflage everything. And then they wait, in total silence, letting every scout and every spotter and every lone helicopter pass by, untouched, giving away nothing, holding a discipline that costs them a dozen tempting shots a day. And then the assault comes. Wave after wave of troop-laden helicopters dropping toward the grass. The gunners wait even now, not for the first aircraft, but for the moment the sky is full of them, hovering, unloading, trapped in the flare. And then every gun opens at once. That is what the restraint was for. Weeks of held fire spent in a single devastating minute on the one target worth revealing everything to kill. The discipline of silence and the fury of the ambush were not opposites. They were the same weapon, and the silence was what loaded it. The Americans did not simply benefit from this dilemma by accident. Over the course of the war, they developed tactics that deliberately deepened it, that made the enemy gunner's choice even harder, and the cost of firing even higher, and the temptation to fire even more of a trap. One of the most effective was the simple fact of the forward air controller, the small spotter plane whose whole job was to find hidden positions. Its presence changed the gunner's math completely, because a gunner did not just have to worry about being seen by the aircraft he fired at, he had to worry about the little plane circling patiently, whose entire purpose was to notice the muzzle flash, mark it, and call the strike. The FAC turned every act of firing into a potentially fatal advertisement, and so the mere knowledge that a spotter plane might be overhead was often enough to keep the gun silent, which was, of course, exactly the point. Then there was the deliberate use of bait. The Americans came to understand the enemy's dilemma so well that they learned to exploit it directly. They would send aircraft over suspected positions specifically to draw fire, to tempt a gunner into revealing himself. A helicopter might fly a tempting, low, slow path across a valley, looking like a careless target, while overhead, unseen, waited the gunships and the strike aircraft, ready to pounce on any position that took the bait. The enemy learned this too, which added yet another layer to the agony. Now the gunner had to wonder, is this tempting target a genuine opportunity, or is it a trap, a lure meant to make me reveal myself? The very temptingness of a target became a reason to suspect it. The Americans built entire hunter-killer teams around this logic. A common arrangement paired a small, low-flying scout helicopter with a gunship flying higher above it. The scout would fly low and slow, deliberately trolling for the enemy, inviting fire, drawing out the hidden positions, and the moment the enemy took the bait and fired on the scout, the gunship above would roll in and destroy the position that had just revealed itself. The scout was the lure, the gunship was the trap, and the whole system was designed around the certainty that a hidden enemy offered a tempting enough low target would eventually be unable to resist firing and would die for it. Picture the pair working a valley. Down low, almost brushing the trees, is the little scout helicopter. The Americans called it a loach, a tiny bubble of a machine with a pilot who has volunteered for the most exposed job in the sky. He flies slow, he flies low, he hovers over suspicious ground, almost daring the tree line to shoot at him. He is deliberately the most tempting target imaginable, and high above him, where you can barely hear it, circles the gunship. A Cobra, all rockets and cannon, watching the scout, waiting. Now, put yourself in the tree line again with the gun. Here comes that little scout right in front of you, low and slow and alone. The easiest shot you will ever have. Every instinct says fire, and every ounce of hard-won experience says the same word back. Wait, because that scout is not alone. It is never alone. Somewhere above it is the thing that will kill you the instant you reveal yourself. The scout is bait, and you know it is bait, and it is still almost impossible not to shoot, because it is right there. That was the trap the Americans built. They did not just punish firing. They made the punishment ride invisibly above the temptation, so that the better the target looked, the more likely it was to be the death of you. Think about what this did to the mind of a gunner on the ground. Every low, slow, tempting American aircraft now carried a question. Is it what it looks like? Or is it bait with death waiting above it? A gunner who fired at the wrong, tempting target was not just revealing himself. He might be springing a trap that had been laid specifically for him. And so the Americans took the enemy's original dilemma, fire and be seen, and wrapped it in a second one. This target might be a lure until the simple act of shooting at an airplane had become a layered, paralyzing gamble that a careful man would refuse most of the time. And that refusal was the victory. This is the crucial point. Every time a gunner decided a target was not worth the risk and held his fire, the Americans had won that small exchange without firing a shot because they had achieved the thing they actually wanted. They had made the sky safer for their aircraft, not by destroying the guns, but by convincing the men behind them not to shoot. An enemy who will not fire is, for most practical purposes, an enemy who is not there. This is the part that is easy to miss, so it is worth saying flatly. The Americans did not need to win the duel between the aircraft and the gun. They needed the duel to never happen. Every gun that stayed silent was, functionally, a gun that had been knocked out. Without a single bomb, without risking a single aircraft, without the enemy even losing a man, a destroyed gun cost the enemy a weapon and a crew. A gun too frightened to fire costs him nothing and does exactly the same job for the Americans. The aircraft passes safely. From the American point of view, the silent gun was almost better than the destroyed one, because the enemy had spent all the effort of building and manning and hiding it and got no use out of it at all. Multiply that across a whole country and a whole war, and you can see the size of what the Americans had achieved. Thousands of guns in thousands of positions, and for most of them, on most days, the men behind them chose not to fire. The enemy had a formidable anti-aircraft force, and the Americans had, to a remarkable degree, talked it into silence, not with words, but with the certainty of what firing would cost. It would be easy to tell the story as a clean American triumph, and it was not one. And the honesty of that is what makes it worth telling. Because the dilemma was real for both sides, and it was paid for in blood by both sides, and the men who flew those low aircraft into that uncertainty were as brave as the men who lay in the tree lines deciding whether to shoot them. Start with the truth that complicates the whole thing. Sometimes the gunners did fire, and sometimes they were right to, and it cost the Americans dearly. For all the discipline of holding fire, the North Vietnamese anti-aircraft effort was, over the course of the war, enormously effective. They shot down thousands of American aircraft. The helicopter losses alone were staggering. The low-flying aircraft that this whole story is about, the scouts, the gunships, the spotters, the medevacs, the troop carriers, died in great numbers precisely because their job required them to be low and slow and close in range of exactly the guns that were deciding whether to fire on them. So the discipline of not shooting was never total, and it was never meant to be. It was a system for choosing the right moment, and when the enemy chose to fire, they were often choosing well, and American crews paid for it. The men who flew those aircraft knew every single day that the quiet tree line they were passing might contain a gun, and a crew, deciding in that exact moment whether they were worth revealing a position for. They flew into that uncertainty anyway, low and slow, because that was the job. Because there were troops to insert, and wounded to lift out, an enemy to find, and all of it had to be done down low in the range of the guns. And the crews developed their own courage around the dilemma, which is its own kind of remarkable. The scout pilots who deliberately flew low to draw fire, who made themselves bait on purpose so the gunships above them could kill the positions that fired, were doing something almost beyond belief when you think about it clearly. Their tactic depended on the enemy shooting at them. They were, in a sense, volunteering to be shot at trusting that the trap would spring in time, knowing that sometimes it would not, and that the price of the whole system was that some of them would be hit before the gunship could answer. That is a very hard way to earn a living, and a great many of those men did not come home. Sit with what the scout pilot actually did, because it is one of the strangest forms of courage in the whole war. His job was to find the enemy, and the way he found the enemy was to fly low enough and slow enough that the enemy would shoot at him. In other words, the tool he used to locate the guns was his own body. He would fly along a tree line at a few feet, hovering, sniffing for danger, and the confirmation that danger was there came in the form of bullets aimed at his cockpit. He was a man who went looking for the thing that would kill him by offering it a clear shot, and then trusted the gunship above him to avenge him faster than the enemy could finish the job. Sometimes the trust was rewarded, and the gunship rolled in and killed the position before it could kill the scout. Sometimes it was not. Sometimes the first the world knew of a gun was that it had just shot down the little helicopter sent to find it. Those pilots knew the odds precisely, and they flew the mission anyway every day because it worked, because a scout drawing fire was the surest way to find the guns that were hunting everyone else. They spent themselves as bait so that others could live. There are not many jobs in the history of war that asked a man to do quite that. So picture the full, terrible symmetry of it. In the tree line, a gunner weighing whether to fire, knowing that shooting might kill him. In the aircraft, a crew flying low and slow, knowing that the quiet ground might erupt at any second, each of them making a bet with their lives every time they crossed paths. Each of them brave. Each of them caught in a system that turned a simple thing, a gun, an airplane, into an agonizing gamble. The Americans had engineered the dilemma, and it worked, and it saved many of their aircraft. But it never made the sky safe, and it never made the enemy gunners cowards, and the men who exploited the enemy's hesitation paid for the privilege in some of the heaviest losses of the war. Tuan survived the war. A great many gunners did not, and a great many air crew did not, and the valley where he once held his fire is quiet now. But the thing he learned in that tree line stayed with him, and it is worth ending on because it is the real lesson of this whole strange contest. Tuan came to understand that the Americans had done something to his weapon that no enemy had ever done before. They had not taken his gun away. They had done something cleverer and, in a way, crueler. They had made him afraid to use it. They had built a world in which his most powerful weapon, the gun that could reach up and kill the aircraft he hated most, had become a thing he had to be frightened of because using it could kill him faster than it could kill them. A soldier's weapon is supposed to be his protection. The Americans had turned Tuan's into a liability that he could only safely use at rare, carefully chosen moments, and had to keep silent the rest of the time, while the aircraft he longed to destroy flew past him, untouched, again and again, and he came to respect the men who flew those aircraft in a way he had not expected to. He had every reason to hate them, but he understood, better than most, what it took to fly low and slow over ground that might be hiding a gun like his. To make yourself a target on purpose, to fly into the uncertainty every day, knowing that any quiet tree line might be the last thing you ever saw. He knew what he and his fellow gunners were and what they could do, and he knew that the men who flew into their range anyway were not fools and were not cowards. They were doing a brave and terrible job, the same as he was on the other side of the same impossible arithmetic. He never fully made peace with the restraint the war had forced on him. No gunner did. It went against everything a soldier is. To lie in a good position with a good gun and a good target in your sights, and to do nothing, to let the enemy fly away because shooting was not worth the cost, is a kind of daily defeat, swallowed over and over for years. The Americans had made him swallow it. They had made an entire army of gunners swallow it, and that swallowed restraint, that vast accumulation of shots not taken, was one of the quietest and most important victories of the entire air war, and almost no one has ever heard of it. He thought about the numbers sometimes, late in his life, and they told the whole story if you knew how to read them. His side had shot down thousands of American aircraft, a genuinely staggering achievement against the most powerful air force in the world. By that measure, the gunners had been magnificent, and they had. But Tuan knew a second number that no one had ever counted, and no one ever could. The number of aircraft his side had let fly past, safe, untouched, on all the days when the target was not worth the position. That number was far larger. It was enormous. It was, in a sense, the true measure of what the Americans had accomplished, not the aircraft the guns destroyed, but the vastly greater number they were allowed to spare because firing had been made too dangerous to risk. Both numbers were real. Both were huge. The first one filled the sky with wreckage and made the Americans bleed. The second one, the invisible one, was the one that let the American air war function at all, that let 100 helicopters cross 100 valleys every day and mostly come home over an enemy who could have fired and mostly chose not to. Tuan had spent his war being one small part of that second number, a gun that stayed silent, a shot not taken, a piece of a victory that would never have a monument because it was made of nothing anyone could see, because it does not look like anything. There is no monument to a shot not fired. There is no record of the helicopters that crossed a valley safely because a gunner decided they were not worth the risk. It is an invisible history, made of held breath and lowered barrels and tempting targets let go, but it was real, and it was everywhere, and it shaped the whole air war. The Americans did not win the sky only by destroying the guns that fired at them. They won it, in large part, by making the men behind those guns afraid to fire at all. Here is what the Americans understood about the war in the sky that their enemy had to learn the hard way. One held breath at a time. The most dangerous thing about a weapon is not always what it can do to the enemy. Sometimes it is what using it does to you. An anti-aircraft gun is a wonderful thing. If you can fire it freely, it reaches up and pulls the enemy's aircraft out of the sky. But the Americans understood that a gun is only useful if the man behind it is willing to pull the trigger. And they set out methodically to make him unwilling. They did it not by destroying his guns, though they destroyed many, but by making the act of firing so dangerous that a rational man would avoid it. They filled the sky with observers who would spot his muzzle flash. They built a chain of retaliation so fast that firing was like pulling a lever that dropped a bomb on your own head. They sent bait to tempt him and traps to punish him for taking it. And slowly, they turned his greatest weapon into his greatest danger. That is a strange and subtle kind of victory, and it is worth understanding because it is not the kind that shows up in the histories. We remember the aircraft that were shot down because you can count them, and photograph the wreckage and name the men who died. We do not remember the aircraft that were not shot down, the ones that flew low and slow across 100 valleys and came home safe, not because no gun could reach them, but because the man behind the gun decided in the crucial second that they were not worth what firing would cost. That invisible safety, purchased by the enemy's own restraint, was one of the largest achievements of the American air war, and it left no trace at all. And it was purchased at a terrible price on both sides, which is the part that must not be forgotten. The gunners who held their fire were not cowards. They were among the most disciplined soldiers of the century, and when they did choose to fire, they were devastating, and they filled the sky with the wreckage of American aircraft. and the men who flew those aircraft low into their range, day after day, knowing what might be waiting in the quiet tree lines, were as brave as any men in that war, and a great many of them did not come home. The dilemma was real. It cut both ways. It was paid for in blood by everyone caught in it. But at the center of it all was one man in one tree line with one perfect shot, deciding not to take it. Tuan let that helicopter fly away not because he could not hit it, and not because he was afraid to die, but because the Americans had taught him the most expensive lesson in that sky, that his own gun, fired at the wrong moment, was the surest way to get himself killed. They had made a brave man with a loaded weapon lie still and watch his enemy escape. That is why NVA gunners were afraid to fire at low-flying American aircraft. Not because they were weak, because the Americans had turned the simple act of shooting into a decision about whether you wanted to live. Now you know why. Thank you for staying with this story all the way to the end. These are the histories worth keeping. Not just the famous battles with their famous names, but the invisible choices made in a held breath that shaped the war as much as any battle did. On both sides of the wire, if it meant something to you, a like genuinely helps. It tells the algorithm that this kind of history matters, and it helps these videos find the people who care about them. If you're not subscribed yet, now is a good time. Hit subscribe and the bell so you never miss a new one. I would love to know where you are watching from today, and if someone in your family served in Vietnam, a pilot, a door gunner, a scout, a grunt on the ground, anyone in any unit, tell me about them in the comments. Every one of those men carried a story, like the one you just heard. Most of them never told it. This is how we make sure they are not forgotten.